Some nights feel colder than others, especially when you're alone. I've spent most of my life on this farm, with nothing but the wind and the stars to keep me company. It wasn't always like this. Years ago, this house was filled with life. My wife Maria and our kids made sure of that. But things change. Maria passed away, and the kids grew up and moved on. Now, it's just me and Bosley, my old dog, living in a house that feels far too big for one person. Most nights, I take a walk to clear my mind. It's a quiet kind of peace that I look forward to, just me and Bosley, circling the property under the night sky. It's funny how familiar things can feel comforting. The way the air smells, the sound of the gravel under my boots, even the shadows cast by the moonlight. I've walked the same path 100 times, and I know every inch of it. Nothing ever changes out here. At least, that's what I thought. But on one of those walks, something strange happened. As we made our way back toward the house, I glanced up at the second-story window. It's the window from the bedroom Maria and I used to share, a room I haven't touched since she passed. For just a second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow, maybe. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, staring up at the window. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone in there? That room has been locked away with all my memories, and no one should be in there. No one at all. Bosley whined beside me, sensing my tension. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I felt something shift. Something wasn't right, and I knew that night was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. The thought of someone inside my house gnawed at me. The idea that a stranger could have stepped into the one room I couldn't bear to enter made my skin crawl. My feet moved before I could think. I rushed inside, Bosley close at my heels, the cool night air still clinging to my skin. I went straight to the second floor, heart thudding in my chest, expecting the worst. When I pushed open the door, nothing had changed. The room was just the way I left it all those years ago, still, untouched, as if frozen in time. Dust coated the furniture, and Maria's old things were neatly packed away in the same boxes I'd left untouched since the day she passed. I stood there, scanning every inch of the room. No sign of anyone. No footprints. No broken logs. Nothing out of place. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but that uneasy feeling clung to me. I lingered for a moment longer, standing in silence, hoping that if there was something or someone, it would make itself known. But all I heard was the sound of my own breath and the low hum of the old house settling around me. I left the room, shutting the door behind me, but the feeling didn't go away. It was as if something unseen was watching me, just out of reach. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that my mind was simply playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something had stirred that night, something I couldn't explain. And somehow, I knew it wouldn't stop there. The house, once just a place of memories, had started to feel different. The kind of different you can't ignore, no matter how hard you try. The first sign that things weren't quite right happened not long after we left the church. At first, it seemed small, so small I thought I was imagining it. It started with little things I couldn't explain. My bedroom door would be open when I knew I'd closed it. A light I had turned off would be glowing softly when I came back into the room. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to forgetfulness, but deep down, it unsettled me. Max and Ali mentioned similar things in passing. Ali told me her keys kept going missing, only to turn up exactly where she'd already looked. Max joked about hearing strange knocks at his front door late at night, but when he went to check, no one was there. We laughed it off at the time, pretending it was nothing, just our nerves playing tricks on us. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had followed us home from that church. The real turning point came late one night when I was in bed, drifting in and out of sleep. That's when I heard its soft footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if someone was carefully walking through my hallway. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still. Then, the door handle rattled softly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room filled with dim yellow light, and everything went quiet. I stared at the door, expecting it to swing open, but nothing happened. The handle sat perfectly still, untouched. I told myself it was a dream, just a lingering fear from that night at the church. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps, the movement, the sense that something was standing right outside that door, it was all too real. And for the first time since that night, I realized that whatever we had encountered in that church wasn't finished with us. It had only just begun. For the night after that, I woke up to a low, rumbling growl from Bosley. It was the kind of growl that lets you know something's wrong. Bosley wasn't the type to make noise without a reason, and in all the years I'd had him, I knew to trust his instincts. I sat up, my body tense, listening carefully. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from above, as if the old wood was shifting under someone's weight. It could have been the house settling. At least, that's what I told myself. But the sound came from directly overhead, from the room I had just checked the night before. The same room that should have been empty. I lay still, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. My fingers itched to grab my rifle from the closet, but I resisted. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was all in my head. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak, as if someone was testing the floor with careful steps. It wasn't just the noise that bothered me. It was the feeling that came with it, a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Bosley stood at the foot of the bed, ears perked and eyes locked on the ceiling, a low growl still rumbling in his throat. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, running my hand along the nightstand, where I kept a flashlight. I knew I had to check upstairs, even though every part of me was screaming to stay put. But sitting still wasn't an option. I had to know what or who was up there. With the flashlight in hand, I made my way to the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, the old wood groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, everything was silent again. I stood outside the bedroom door, heart pounding so loudly it felt like the whole house could hear it. Slowly, I opened the door, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was exactly as I had left it. Nothing had moved, nothing was out of place. But the air felt different, thicker, colder. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, standing there in that doorway, that I wasn't imagining things. Something had shifted in this house, and no amount of logic or reason could convince me otherwise. I stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, waiting for the unease to pass, but it never did. Whatever had stirred in the night wasn't going away, and from that moment on, the nights began to change. It didn't take long before the strange occurrences became a nightly routine. Every night brought something new, small, unsettling things that I couldn't explain. At first, it was little noises, faint clicks, soft shuffling sounds in the hallways, the kind of noises that could almost be ignored. But then, the lights started acting up. One night, I walked downstairs to get a drink, only to find the kitchen lights blazing. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, knowing full well that I had turned them off before bed. I was never careless about things like that. But there they were, glowing brightly, as if someone had switched them on while I was asleep. That was when it hit me I wasn't just hearing things. Someone, or something, was moving through the house when I wasn't looking. It felt like I was losing control over a place that I had always considered mine. A cold fear settled in the pit of my stomach, making it hard to think straight. I tried locking every door and window before bed, but it didn't make a difference. Every morning something felt off. Drawers left ajar, objects slightly out of place, as if someone had been rifling through them when I wasn't around. The tension in the air was unbearable. I couldn't focus during the day, and at night, I lay in bed waiting, listening for the next creak, the next flicker of a light, or the next unfamiliar sound in the silence. I was living on edge, never sure what I would wake up to. Bosley sensed it too. He had started pacing the house at night, tail low, ears perked, always on alert. He would stop suddenly, staring into dark corners as if he saw something I couldn't. I tried telling myself it was nothing, that it was just an old house making old sounds. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, I knew better. The night I called the police was the worst. I had convinced myself that someone was inside. I searched the house twice, room by room, but I couldn't find anything. That's when the fear really took hold, because if there wasn't someone inside, then what was causing all of this? When the officers arrived, they were polite but unconvinced. They checked every corner, every closet, every dark space I pointed them to, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had ever been inside. As they left, one of the officers gave me a sympathetic smile and told me to call if I needed anything. But I could see it in their eyes, they didn't believe me. To them, it was just another call from a man living alone, hearing things that weren't really there. But I knew the truth. Something was inside this house with me, and whatever it wasn't done. The nights dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Sleep had become a distant memory. Every sound, every flicker of movement kept me on high alert. I found myself roaming the house with Bosley late into the night, as if staying awake would keep the unease at bay. But deep down, I knew something was building. Then it happened. I don't know what made me do it, but I decided to go upstairs again, back to that room. Maybe I thought facing whatever was in there would put my mind at ease. Or maybe I just couldn't stand not knowing anymore. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and what I saw inside stopped me cold. Maria's clothes, the ones I had carefully packed away, were scattered across the floor like a cruel reminder of what I'd lost. Shirts, dresses, and sweaters lay in tangled heaps, as if someone had rummaged through them in a frenzy. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just strange anymore. This was personal. And then I saw her. A woman standing in the doorway. She was smaller than Maria, her features blurred by the dim light, but I could tell immediately this wasn't my wife. She didn't say a word, just stared at me, motionless. Her presence felt wrong, like she didn't belong in this world or any other. Instinct took over. I lunged at her, rage and fear boiling over inside me. But before I could reach her, she turned and bolted down the stairs. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the house as she disappeared into the night. I ran after her, Bosley close behind. But by the time I got to the front door, she was gone, vanished into the darkness, as if she had never been there. I searched the property, flashlight in hand, calling for Bosley to help me track her down. We scoured every inch of the yard, the woods, and the fields, but there was no trace of her. No footprints, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. It was as if she had melted into the shadows. Standing there, breathing hard under the cold night sky, I realized that this wasn't just a break-in. This was something more, something I couldn't quite understand. I had seen her with my own eyes, felt her presence like a weight pressing down on my soul. And yet, she was gone. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out into the darkness, waiting to see if she would return. But the night remained silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. As I made my way back inside, a cold certainty settled over me. This wasn't over. She had come once, and she could come again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. The nights after that encounter felt like a waking nightmare. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every creak of the floorboard became a warning. I wasn't just living in my house anymore. I was guarding it, trapped in a constant state of fear. Sleep was impossible. Even when exhaustion weighed me down, I kept jolting awake at the slightest noise. My nerves were shot, and it felt like my mind was slipping. I started keeping my rifle within arm's reach, leaning it against the nightstand like a silent guardian. It wasn't just for peace of mind, it was a necessity. Every time the wind brushed against the windows or the old pipes groaned, I found myself gripping the rifle, heart pounding, ready for something to appear out of the darkness. Bosley had become just as restless. He would roam the house, ears twitching, head snapping towards sounds only he seemed to hear. Sometimes, he'd stop in front of the door to that room, standing so still it was as if he were waiting for something to emerge from behind it. I didn't like the way he acted, like he knew something was coming. I thought about calling my brother, just to have someone else in the house with me. But the idea of admitting I needed help didn't sit right. I've handled everything on my own my whole life, and I wasn't about to change that now. But the truth was, the weight of it was starting to crush me. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the waiting. Every night, I braced myself, expecting to hear her footsteps or see her standing just outside the window. The silence became unbearable, stretching out until every second felt like an eternity. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for anything to happen. It was as if the house had taken on a life of its own, feeding off my fear. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, and even the familiar hum of the appliances sounded sinister. I tried to keep my routine, hoping that if I just carried on, things would go back to normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I knew this wasn't sustainable. Living like this on edge, every moment filled with dread was eating away at me. I kept telling myself that I could manage, that I could wait it out. But the truth was, I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The fear had taken root, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. The night it all came to a head, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual, thick with an eerie stillness. Something was brewing, I could feel it in my bones. I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, the rifle resting across my lap. Bosley was curled up at my feet, though his ears twitched at every little noise, just as mine did. I was too tired to move, too tired to think, but there was no escaping the sense that something was about to happen. Then I saw her. She was standing outside the window, just beyond the glass, her outline barely visible under the pale light of the moon. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she was studying me, waiting for me to notice her. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was the same woman, there was no mistaking it. And this time, She wasn't running. She was waiting. I forced myself to stand, heart hammering in my chest, and grabbed the rifle. Bosley sprang to his feet, barking wildly now, the fur along his back standing on end. I yanked the door open and stepped outside, raising the rifle, aiming straight at her. But she didn't flinch. She just stood there, her dark silhouette blending into the shadows. I fired 2 shots into the air, hoping the sound would scare her off. The blast echoed across the empty fields, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without a word or a sound, she turned and disappeared into the night, slipping into the darkness like a ghost. I wanted to chase her, but my legs felt like lead, and my mind screamed at me to stay put. Bosley barked and growled at the spot where she had been standing, as if the air still held her presence. I stood there for a long time, rifle in hand, waiting to see if she would come back. But the night swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind, not even footprints in the dirt. I knew, as I stood there under the cold sky, that this wasn't over. She might be gone for now, but she would return, of that I was certain. And next time, I had no idea what she would want or how far she'd go. When I finally went back inside, I didn't feel relief, just a gnawing emptiness. I sat on the edge of the bed, rifle still in my lap, and stared at the wall until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The fear wasn't just in the house anymore, it had taken root inside me. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. And I knew that one day, sooner or later, she'd be back. The days that followed felt like a blur, but the fear never left. It clung to me, even in broad daylight, when everything should have felt safe. I kept telling myself that I'd imagined it all, that maybe the woman was just a figment of my exhausted mind. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the doubt lingered, gnawing away at my thoughts. Every time I glanced toward the window, I half expected to see her standing there, watching me from the shadows. I found myself checking the locks over and over, walking through the house at odd hours, looking for something I knew I wouldn't find. The silence in the house felt unnatural, as though it was waiting just like me. Bosley never stopped patrolling the rooms at night, his claws clicking softly against the wooden floors. I took comfort in his presence, but even that wasn't enough to quiet the constant hum of anxiety in my mind. I knew that whatever had started wasn't over. It felt like the calm before a storm, a quiet tension that promised more to come. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I tell them? That I saw a woman who vanished without a trace. They didn't believe me the first time, and I knew they wouldn't believe me now. It felt like I was on my own, trapped in this invisible game that I couldn't win. The worst part wasn't the fear itself, it was the waiting. Waiting for her to come back. Waiting for the next strange sound, the next flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I was living in a constant state of anticipation, bracing myself for something I couldn't predict. I tried to go about my day as if things were normal, but nothing felt right anymore. Even small tasks, like making coffee or walking Bosley around the property, felt strange and disconnected, like I was going through the motions of someone else's life. Every night, I sat in the dark, rifle by my side, listening for sounds that didn't belong. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. But what choice did I have? It wasn't just my house that felt haunted, it was me. And no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was waiting, watching, biding its time. I didn't know when or how it would happen, but I knew deep down that she wasn't finished. And somehow, knowing that was worse than any scream in the night. It was the silence that scared me the most, the silence before everything falls apart. Some nights feel endless, especially when you're on the road, driving through the dark with nothing but the hum of the engine to keep you company. That's how it usually is for me. I work for a catering service, hauling supplies from one event to another. Most nights, I'm out late, far past the point when the rest of the world has gone to sleep. Driving that big company truck feels like a job I just fell into, something I never planned for but can't seem to get out of. The hours are long, and the pay barely makes it worth it. By the time I pull into my driveway at night, I'm either too wired from downing energy drinks or so drained that I crash the moment I hit the bed. There's no in between. One night, I was heading home after a shift that dragged on longer than usual. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty except for the occasional streetlight flickering by. I was glad to be in my own car this time, not the clunky truck. But as soon as I got closer to my house, hunger hit me hard. It wasn't just any hunger, it was that strange, sudden craving for fast food. The kind of craving where only something greasy will do. McDonald's came to mind immediately. It was just off the highway, only a few minutes out of the way, and open 24/7. Perfect. Without thinking twice, I turned off the road and made my way to the drive-thru. I figured I'd grab some fries, maybe a burger, and head back home to eat. Just a quick stop. Or at least, that's what I thought. But things that seem simple never stay that way. Not that night. Something strange was waiting, just out of sight, ready to unfold. I pulled into the drive-thru, expecting the usual late-night quiet. A few cars were ahead of me, and the line moved slowly, as it always does when you're tired and hungry. My mind drifted, and I found myself zoning out, tapping the steering wheel absent-mindedly. That's when I noticed it, a car parked off to the side, tucked into the far corner of the lot. It was an old, beat-up Volkswagen with dark, tinted windows. It sat there like it didn't belong, far from the reserved spots for employees. It wasn't close to the entrance either, which made it seem even more out of place. I thought maybe someone was just taking a break or eating inside, but something about it made me uneasy. I kept glancing over, waiting for any sign of movement, but the car stayed perfectly still. There was no music coming from it, no flicker of light from a phone or radio, just silence. The windows were so dark I couldn't see inside, which only added to the weirdness. It felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. It wasn't that unusual, right? People sit in parking lots all the time. Maybe they were just tired and needed a place to stop for a bit. But the thought gnawed at me, and I couldn't help but keep my eyes on that car. Something about it made my skin crawl. Finally, it was my turn to order. I gave my order quickly, but that uneasy feeling stayed with me. As I pulled forward to the window to grab my food, I stole one last glance toward the Volkswagen. It hadn't moved an inch. I told myself to let it go, just eat, get home, and forget about it. But a strange thought flickered in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that the car wasn't just there by accident. It was like it was waiting for something, or someone. With the food bag sitting on the passenger seat, I drove aimlessly for a few minutes, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The thought of going straight home didn't sit right with me, like I needed a little more time to unwind. I figured a quick stop at the old nature preserve down the street wouldn't hurt. It was one of those places I used to visit all the time, back when life was simpler. The preserve was quiet at night, and I knew the view from the lookout point would give me a moment of peace. The road leading to it was familiar, winding through tall trees that stood like silent giants in the dark. When I finally reached the gravel lot outside the preserve, it was empty, just as I expected. I pulled in, switched off the engine, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Before I could even relax, headlights swept across the lot. I sat up straight, watching as a car slowly rolled in behind me. My stomach tightened as I recognized it, the same Volkswagen from the McDonald's parking lot. It was unmistakable. The same dull paint, the same worn edges, and those same tinted windows hiding whatever or whoever was inside. My heart began to race. What were the odds of seeing that same car here, in the middle of the night? It wasn't a popular spot, especially at this hour. And yet, here it was, sitting in the same lot as me, parked a little too perfectly to feel like a coincidence. The engine cut off, and everything went silent. I gripped the steering wheel, suddenly aware of how isolated this place really was. No street lights, no other cars, just the vast darkness of the trees surrounding us. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just someone else looking for a quiet place to park. But deep down, I knew better. The unease crept in, stronger than before. Something wasn't right, and the air felt heavy with tension. I glanced toward the Volkswagen, hoping to see some sign of life, a face, a phone screen, anything, but the windows stayed dark. A knot formed in my stomach, and I knew this wasn't just a harmless coincidence. I thought about leaving, but some stubborn part of me didn't want to run. Not yet. Instead, I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Sebastian's name. If anyone could help shake off the bad feeling, I sat there for a while, trying to calm the knot forming in my chest. But the longer I stayed, the heavier the tension grew. I kept glancing at the Volkswagen, waiting for some sign of movement, anything to help explain why it was there. The longer it stayed still, the more my nerves frayed. The lot was too quiet. My fingers hovered over my phone, debating whether to just leave or stick around. I hated how paranoid I felt, but the whole situation didn't sit right. Something told me it wasn't just chance that brought us both to the same places that night. After a few minutes of sitting in that silence, I pulled out my phone and FaceTimed my friend Sebastian. I needed someone else there, someone who'd keep my mind from spiraling any further. Thankfully, he picked up almost immediately, sounding groggy but awake. "I'll head over," he said after I explained what was going on. He lived close by, just a few minutes away. I felt a small sense of relief knowing I wouldn't be alone much longer. Until then, I kept my eyes locked on the Volkswagen, afraid to look away. The car sat there like a shadow, unmoving, as if it were waiting for the perfect moment to spring to life. My stomach churned with unease, and every passing second felt heavier than the last. I gripped my phone tightly, counting the minutes until Sebastian arrived. When his headlights finally appeared at the edge of the lot, a weight lifted off my chest. I waved him down, and as soon as he parked, I jumped out of my car. The Volkswagen hadn't moved the entire time, which somehow made things feel worse. Sebastian stepped out, looking half awake but curious. I told him everything in hushed whispers, pointing toward the Volkswagen as if it would suddenly lurch toward us. He looked at the car, then back at me, raising an eyebrow. "You sure you're not just imagining things?" he asked, his voice low but cautious. I wished I could believe that. But deep down, I knew this was more than just paranoia. Something wasn't right, and I had a feeling we were about to find out exactly what. With Sebastian by my side, I felt a bit more grounded, but the tension in the air didn't go away. We started up the path toward the lookout point, leaving the gravel lot and the Volkswagen behind us. I tried to focus on the familiar surroundings, the trees, the soft crunch of dirt beneath our shoes, but my mind kept drifting back to that car. Something wasn't right. Halfway up the path, I glanced back over my shoulder, unable to resist the urge. There it was, the Volkswagen, still sitting in the same spot. But this time, something was different. All four doors swung open at once, and four men stepped out, standing together in the darkness. They didn't say a word, just stood there, silent, as if waiting for something. My pulse quickened. Sebastian noticed them too, nudging me as if to say, "Let's keep moving." We picked up the pace, trying to put some distance between us and the strange figures below. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing on my back, even as we turned a bend in the path and they slipped out of view. When we finally reached the top of the trail, the view of the city stretched out before us. Normally, the sight would have been comforting, but not that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that those men weren't far behind. And just as I feared, they weren't. Moments later, we heard footsteps coming up the trail, 3 of them this time, walking side by side, talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. They seemed friendly enough on the surface, but something about them felt off. Too casual, too comfortable. One of them, a guy covered in tattoos and wearing a nose ring, flashed us a grin. He held out a blunt, offering it like we were old friends. Sebastian and I shook our heads, politely declining. The man's smile twisted into something colder, and one of his friends chuckled under his breath, calling us names that were meant to sound playful but didn't. I tried to act calm, but curiosity got the better of me. "You guys were at McDonald's earlier, right?" I asked, forcing the words out. The moment I said it, the mood shifted. Their smiles disappeared, replaced by blank, guarded expressions. They stared at us, as if sizing us up, and suddenly, the night air felt colder. Something was very wrong, and I could tell we had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. For a moment, we stood there in tense silence, their stares lingering far too long. My heart pounded, and I could see the same unease settling over Sebastian. These guys weren't just making small talk, they were sizing us up, deciding whether we were worth the trouble. Then it hit me. There had been 4 men who stepped out of the Volkswagen, but now only 3 stood in front of us. The realization sent a chill down my spine. My mind raced, wondering where the 4th guy had gone and why he was hiding. Sebastian shifted beside me, his gaze flicking between the men and the trail we had just walked. He must have been thinking the same thing. It felt like we were being cornered, like something was about to snap, and neither of us knew what to expect. The man with the blunt spoke again, breaking the silence. "So, you two hang out here often?" he asked, his tone too casual, too friendly. I could feel the trap closing around us. He wasn't just asking, he was testing us, seeing how much we would say, how comfortable we'd let ourselves feel. Sebastian and I exchanged a quick glance, the same thought running through both of our minds. We needed to leave. Now. But before we could make a move, one of the men leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing. "You know," he said slowly, "it's kind of weird seeing people out this late. Not many folks come up here after dark." His words felt like a warning, a way of letting us know they were in control. My skin prickled with fear. The man with the blunt gave a sly smile, lifting his hoodie to reveal a McDonald's uniform underneath. "Just got off work," he added, as if that explained everything. I forced a nod, trying not to show how badly the weight of his words hung in the air, as if he knew something we didn't. Every instinct told me to walk away, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I tried to play it off with a shrug, but my mind was racing. Where was the 4th guy? Why hadn't he come with them? Then Sebastian froze, his hand gripping my arm. He wasn't looking at the men anymore, he was staring into the woods. My eyes followed his, And that's when I saw him. The fourth man. He was partially hidden among the trees, standing perfectly still. And in his hand, he held something long and thin, but it was too dark to tell what it was. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't with the others because he was waiting, watching from the shadows like a predator, calculating his next move. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some strange encounter. These men had a plan, and we were standing right in the middle of it. The three men noticed our shift in attention and turned to see what we were looking at. When the hidden man realized he'd been spotted, he began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, stepping out from the cover of the trees. My heart slammed against my ribs as the other three men spread out slightly, like they were preparing to surround us. Without thinking, I grabbed Sebastian's arm. "Run," I whispered, barely able to force the word out. And in an instant, we were sprinting down the trail, the sound of footsteps thundering behind us. I didn't dare look back. The only thing I could focus on was the path ahead, the sharp turns, and the sound of Sebastian's breath beside me. The darkness closed in around us, and every step felt like it might be our last. I knew if we stopped even for a second, we wouldn't make it. The pounding footsteps behind us grew louder, as if they were right on our heels. My legs burned, and my lungs ached, but fear kept me moving. The only thing that mattered now was reaching the parking lot, getting to the car, and escaping before it was too late. We burst out of the trail and into the gravel lot, our hearts racing and lungs burning. The cold night air hit my face, but I couldn't stop not yet. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to unlock the door. Behind us, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and I knew the men weren't far behind. Sebastian threw open his car door, and I jumped into mine, slamming it shut just as the first shadow appeared at the edge of the trail. I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. Without waiting another second, I floored the gas. Gravel sprayed beneath my tires as I sped out of the lot, Sebastian right behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw them rushing back toward the Volkswagen, scrambling to get inside. My heart pounded in my chest, fear driving me forward as fast as I could go. The road twisted and turned, and I didn't dare slow down until I was far from the preserve. Even then, I didn't head straight home. The thought of those men following me, tracking me to my doorstep, sent a chill through me. I couldn't risk it. I grabbed my phone, calling Sebastian as I pulled onto a side street. We agreed to meet near his house, just to be sure we weren't being followed. When we finally met up, both of us were still shaken, barely able to catch our breath. Sebastian leaned against his car, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice tight with disbelief. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we had gotten away for now. But the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see headlights in the distance, the Volkswagen trailing us in the dark. The next morning, we drove back to the McDonald's, hoping to find someone who could help us make sense of what happened. We showed a young employee the photo Sebastian had snapped of the men. His face paled as he recognized one of them. "That guy used to work here," the employee whispered. "He got fired a few months ago, and he's been stalking his ex ever since. She used to work the night shift, and he'd camp out here, waiting for her." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just a random encounter. Those men weren't just looking for trouble, they had already found it. And somehow, we had crossed paths with them at the worst possible time. Even though we escaped that night, the fear didn't leave me. Every time I passed a parked car with dark windows, my heart skipped a beat. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that Volkswagen again, lurking just out of sight. I knew it wasn't over, not really. And the worst part, I couldn't shake the feeling that they would remember me. In the days that followed, the fear stuck with me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every time I got into my car, I found myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the Volkswagen trailing behind. Even when I knew the streets were empty, the paranoia didn't let go. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps chasing us down the trail, the heavy breathing, and the snap of branches under their feet. Sebastian tried to laugh it off, saying we were overthinking things, but I knew he felt it too. There was something about that night that didn't sit right. It wasn't just a close call, it felt personal, like we had stumbled into something dangerous by sheer accident. And even though we had escaped, the weight of what could have happened lingered in the back of my mind. The scariest part wasn't just what they did, it was what they didn't do. They let us go, almost too easily. That thought haunted me more than anything else. It made me wonder, did they give up because we got away too fast? Or were they just toying with us, planning to strike when we least expected it? I couldn't bring myself to go back to the preserve, and every time I drove past that McDonald's, my stomach twisted in knots. The memory of those cold, empty stairs was burned into my mind, and it was all too easy to imagine them sitting in another parking lot, watching, waiting. I kept checking the photos Sebastian took, zooming in on their faces, hoping to find some clue, some way to understand what they wanted. But the more I looked, the more I felt the walls close in around me. There were no answers, just questions that wouldn't leave me alone. The police told us they would look into it, but I could tell by the way they spoke that it wasn't a priority. To them, it was just another strange story, something to be filed away and forgotten. But I couldn't forget. At night, the smallest noises would jolt me awake every car. There's something about growing up in a small town that makes you desperate to find excitement, no matter where it comes from. For me and my friends, that thrill came from exploring places we shouldn't have been. Abandoned buildings, old factories, run-down houses, we made them all part of our playground. But the one place that always pulled us back was the old church in Nobath. It wasn't just any old building. There was something different about it, something that gave you chills the moment you stepped through the door. The first time we went inside, we knew it would become our favorite spot. It was isolated, eerie, and filled with that strange, heavy silence that makes your skin crawl. We loved it. The group of us, Luna, Gina, Johnny, Max, Ali, and me, had been to the church a few times before. It was always the same, a mix of laughter, stupid dares, and a little drinking. None of us ever talked about how creepy it really was. We just treated it like another adventure, even though deep down, we all knew we were tempting fate. That night in the fall, the air had a sharp bite, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter. It felt like the perfect night for one more trip to the church before winter settled in. We didn't need much convincing. The idea of sneaking in, drinking a little, and poking around the old place sounded like the kind of fun only we could understand. But as much as we tried to laugh off the fear, something felt different that night. It wasn't just the cold or the quiet, it was the way the place seemed to be waiting for us, like it knew we were coming back. We should have turned around right then and there, but none of us did. And that was the first mistake we made. We met just after sunset, bundled up in jackets and scarves, ready to take on the night. The old church stood in the back of our minds like a dare we couldn't resist. It wasn't just about the thrill, it was about pushing limits, about proving to ourselves that we weren't afraid of anything, or at least pretending we weren't. Getting into the church wasn't easy, but we had done it enough times to know the routine. The fence was tall and sharp at the top, but we climbed it like pros, laughing as we boosted each other over. The windows were boarded shut, except for one on the side that we had discovered on our second visit. It was just big enough for us to squeeze through, one by one, landing on the dirt floor inside. This time, the air inside felt heavier, like the place had been sitting in the cold for too long, untouched. The silence swallowed every noise we made, as if the walls were waiting for something. But we shook it off and made our way to the basement, where we always ended up. The basement was our favorite part of the church. It felt like a hidden world, tucked away from everything above. It had 3 rooms, but we only ever stayed in the largest one. Old furniture was scattered across the floor, broken chairs, a sagging couch, things that looked like they had been left to rot for decades. It was the kind of place that should have felt abandoned, but it never did. Not entirely. Johnny, always the loudest among us, cracked open a bottle, his laugh echoing off the walls. We settled in, passing drinks around and trying to act like we owned the place. It was what we did best, take something eerie and turn it into a joke, as if humor could drive away whatever waited in the shadows. But no matter how much we laughed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the church was different this time. It wasn't just a spot for fun anymore. It felt like we had crossed an invisible line, like the place knew we were here, and it wasn't happy about it. Once we were all inside, the familiar chill of the place hit us, sinking deep into our bones. It wasn't just the cold air from outside, it was something else, something that felt almost alive. The kind of feeling that makes the hairs on your arms stand up, even when nothing's happening. None of us said it out loud, but we could all feel it. The air was heavier, thicker, as if the walls were holding on to something we weren't supposed to disturb. We made our way through the dusty hallways, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the dirt floor beneath us. It looked the same as always, empty, broken, forgotten. But somehow, it felt different, as though the silence inside the church was more deliberate this time, like it was waiting for us to do something. We reached the basement stairs, our usual destination. The concrete steps led down into the dark, and despite how many times we had been here before, there was always that moment of hesitation at the top. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the way the basement seemed to pull you in, making you feel like once you stepped down, the world above wouldn't exist anymore. The largest room in the basement had become our hangout spot over the years. It was where we always ended up, no matter what. A few pieces of old furniture still remained, but they were barely holding together, chairs missing legs, a couch with its stuffing spilling out. We joked that the place looked like a hideout for ghosts, but even the jokes didn't feel right tonight. Johnny cracked open his bottle again, trying to lighten the mood with some over-the-top laugh. Luna rolled her eyes, pretending not to be annoyed, while Gina and Ali started chatting to fill the awkward silence. But Max and I kept quiet. Something about the place gnawed at me, a strange itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. It wasn't just the cold or the emptiness. It was the way the shadows seemed thicker tonight, like they had weight, like they could press in if they wanted to. And no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, it stuck with me. It was as if the church itself was holding its breath, waiting for. The hallway felt longer than I remembered, stretching into the dark like it didn't want to end. Every step we took felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on us. None of us spoke. The only sound was the crunch of dirt beneath our shoes and the occasional flicker of our flashlights bouncing off the cracked walls. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, loud and unsteady, as we reached the door that had slammed shut. The door stood slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. It looked ordinary, just an old wooden door warped by time, but it carried an unsettling presence. The kind of presence that makes you hesitate, even when nothing seems obviously wrong. Ali went ahead, nudging the door open with her foot. It groaned loudly as it swung inward, revealing a small room beyond. The first thing we noticed was the dresser. It sat against the far wall, ancient and covered in dust. Its mirror was cracked, shards of glass forming jagged lines across the surface like a web. But what caught our attention most were the red stains smeared across it, fresh, sticky, and shining faintly under the weak beam of Max's flashlight. Ali stepped closer, her breath shaky. "What is that?" she whispered, though none of us really wanted to know the answer. I leaned in, hoping it was old paint or rust, but deep down, I knew better. It hadn't been there long. Whatever had left those marks, it hadn't been gone for very long. Max shifted nervously, taking a step back as if the room itself was dangerous. I felt the same, but something kept me rooted in place. On top of the dresser lay a photograph, slightly warped with age. It showed a woman in a wedding dress, her expression strange, more forced than joyful. There was something off about the photo, though I couldn't put my finger on it. The uneasy silence grew thicker. It was the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you can't see anyone else. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone standing behind us in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just darkness. "We shouldn't be here," Max muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. For once, I agreed with him. Something had changed in the air, something that warned us we were intruding on a place we didn't belong. But just as I turned to leave, another noise echoed from the room we had come from, freezing us all in place. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps. And they weren't ours. We were just starting to settle in when the first sign that something was wrong hit us. A loud slam echoed through the basement, sharp and deliberate, like a door being kicked shut. The sound cut through our conversations and stopped us all cold. For a second, no one said a word. We just stared at each other, our faces lit only by the faint glow of a phone screen. "What was that?" Gina whispered, her voice tight with unease. Nobody answered. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the darkness was complete. The door that slammed wasn't near us, it came from somewhere deeper in the basement, where the shadows felt even thicker. My heart started to race, a sudden jolt of fear rushing through me. Luna was the first to react. "It's just the wind," she muttered, though it was clear from her voice she didn't believe it. Johnny, already on edge from drinking too much, jumped up and declared, "I'm not staying to find out." Before any of us could stop him, he bolted for the stairs, with Luna and Gina right behind him. Their footsteps echoed as they scrambled out of the basement without looking back. That left me, Max, and Ali standing there, frozen in place. None of us wanted to admit it, but the thought of running crossed our minds too. Still, we stayed. Not out of bravery, but out of that strange, stubborn curiosity that makes you want to know what's hiding in the dark, even when you know you shouldn't look. "Probably just one of those old doors shifting," Max offered weakly, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, not because I believed him, but because I needed something to hold on to, even if it was a lie. Ali glanced toward the hallway where the noise had come from. "We should at least check it out," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Part of me wanted to say no, to leave with the others and never come back. But instead, I found myself nodding again, as if some unseen force was pulling me toward whatever had made that sound. With hesitant steps, we moved toward the hallway, each of us gripping our flashlights like lifelines. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and with every step, the feeling in my gut grew stronger. Something wasn't right. But we kept moving, drawn by the need to see what was waiting beyond that door. The sound of footsteps sent a jolt through all of us, our nerves stretched thin like a wire ready to snap. For a moment, none of us dared to move. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat feeling louder than the next. Max flicked his flashlight toward the door, his hand shaking just enough to make the beam tremble on the walls. "We need to go," Ali whispered urgently, her voice tight with fear. But none of us moved. It felt like the walls were closing in, trapping us with something we couldn't see. That same strange pull that had kept us here earlier now felt more sinister, as if whatever was down here wanted us to stay forever. I turned back to the dresser, drawn once more to the photograph sitting there. Something about it gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. I picked it up, the edges brittle and warped under my fingertips. The woman in the wedding dress stared back at me, her smile so slight it was almost a smirk. But it wasn't just her expression that bothered me, it was the way her eyes seemed to follow me, no matter how I tilted the picture. The air in the room felt thicker, pressing in around us like a cold, invisible hand. I couldn't look away from the photo. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I was missing something, like the image was hiding a truth I didn't want to see. My hand shook as I placed the picture back down, my stomach twisting with unease. Ali shifted beside me, her breath shallow. "Something's not right," she murmured. Max glanced toward the hallway again, his jaw clenched. "We shouldn't have stayed," he muttered, his voice low and filled with regret. Then, just as we were about to turn and leave, we heard a low, shuffling noise coming from the room we had just left. It was subtle at first, like fabric brushing against the walls, but it grew louder with each second. My blood ran cold as I realized we weren't alone. Max and Ali both looked at me, their eyes wide with fear. I knew we had to leave, but something in the room held us there, rooted to the spot. It was as if the church didn't want to let us go, as if we had crossed some unseen boundary and now belonged to it. And whatever was lurking in the shadows, it knew that too. The shuffling sound grew louder, creeping closer like something dragging itself toward us through the darkness. We didn't wait to find out what it was. Max was the first to move, grabbing Ali's arm and yanking her toward the hallway. "Go," he shouted, his voice sharp and panicked. That was all it took to snap us into motion. We bolted for the stairs, hearts pounding and footsteps echoing wildly against the bare concrete walls. Every step felt like a battle, our shoes slipping on dirt, elbows banging against the narrow walls. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it behind us, whatever it was, gaining ground with each passing second. The basement seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as if the building itself was warping, twisting to keep us trapped inside. My breath burned in my lungs, and my legs ached, but fear pushed me forward. Ali stumbled once, catching herself on the wall, and Max grabbed her before she could fall completely. "Keep moving," he yelled over his shoulder. We hit the bottom of the stairs, and I felt a surge of relief. Just a few more steps, and we'd be out. But as I reached the top, something made me glance back, just for a split second. That's when I saw it, a shadow standing at the far end of the hallway, watching us silently from the doorway we had left open. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. Just seeing it there, waiting, was enough to freeze my blood. I turned back and threw myself through the stairwell door, Max and Ali right behind me. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The chain link fence loomed ahead, taller than it had ever seemed before. Max scrambled up first, his movements frantic, and I followed close behind. Ali was the last to climb, her hands slipping on the cold metal as she pulled herself over. We hit the ground running, the three of us sprinting down the empty street without looking back. The sound of our shoes slapping the pavement was the only thing I could hear, drowning out the hammering of my heart. We didn't stop until we were far enough away that the church was just a distant shadow on the horizon. When we finally slowed, gasping for air, Max turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I had no answer. All I knew was that we had made it out barely. But whatever was waiting in that basement, it wasn't done with us. Not yet. And somehow, I knew we had just escaped by the slimmest margin. We didn't speak much after that night. No one wanted to bring it up, as if saying it out loud would make it real again. Ali, Max, and I tried to move on, but the memory stuck with us like a scar that refused to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark silhouette standing at the end of the hall, watching, waiting. I kept telling myself it was over, that we had escaped. But something about the way the church felt that night gnawed at me. It was as if the place had been waiting for us all along, drawing us in like prey into a trap. And though we had gotten away, it felt like a part of us had stayed behind, left in the shadows of that basement. We never went back, not together, at least. In the weeks that followed, I found myself lying awake at night, replaying every moment in my mind. I thought about the strange photo on the dresser, the fresh red stains, and the heavy silence that seemed to breathe down our necks. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. Years later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the spot where the church used to stand, hoping to find some kind of closure. But when I got there, the building was gone. In its place was an empty lot, flattened and fenced off, as if the place had been erased from existence. I scoured the internet, searching for any mention of the old church, its history, rumors, anything that could explain what we had experienced. But I found nothing. No records, no urban legends, not even a mention of the address. It was as if the church had never existed at all. I kept the photos Sebastian had snapped of that night, though I rarely looked at it. When I did, it brought back the same eerie feeling, like I was still being watched. I'd hoped time would make the memory easier to bear, but it didn't. If anything, the mystery grew heavier with every passing year. Sometimes I wonder what really happened that night. Did we stumble into something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world? Or was it all in our heads, a trick of fear and imagination? I doubt I'll ever know. What I do know is this: I am grateful we weren't alone that night. If I had been by myself, I might not have made it out. And even now, after all these years, part of me is still waiting for the answer. Or maybe, just maybe, I'm waiting for the shadows to find me again. Even now, I can't escape the feeling that we left something behind that night, or maybe it followed us. There are moments, usually late at night, when I catch myself listening for sounds that don't belong. A faint shuffle in the hallway, the creak of a door. It's subtle, but it's enough to set my heart racing, pulling me back to that basement in an instant. Ali moved out of town not long after, and Max stopped talking about what happened altogether. I don't blame them. Some things are easier to forget when you bury them deep. But I never found that peace. The memory stays with me, buried just beneath the surface, waiting to rise when the nights grow too quiet. Sometimes, I wonder if we were meant to leave that night, if we were supposed to walk out of that place at all. It didn't feel like we escaped by chance. It felt like something let us go, like it had decided we weren't ready to understand what we had stumbled into. And that thought is almost worse than the fear itself. The fact that the church no longer exists only makes it harder to shake. If I had just one trace, one piece of evidence, maybe I could convince myself it was all real, or maybe I could finally believe it wasn't. But there's nothing. No building, no history, no sign it was ever there. Just a lingering shadow in the back of my mind, always waiting to resurface. I've learned to live with the questions, though they never stop gnawing at me. Sometimes, when I look out my window late at night, I find myself expecting to see someone standing just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, like that shadow in the basement, patient and still. There are things in this world we aren't meant to understand. I believe that now more than ever. What we found that night in the church was one of those things, something ancient, quiet, and dangerous. And though it let us leave, I know that we'll never really be free of it. Not entirely. The worst part. I know I'll never go back to that place. But sometimes I wonder if it'll find its way back to me. And if it does, I don't think I'll be able to run fast enough this time. The first sign that things weren't quite right happened not long after we left the church. At first, it seemed small, so small I thought I was imagining it. It started with little things I couldn't explain. My bedroom door would be open when I knew I'd closed it. A light I had turned off would be glowing softly when I came back into the room. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to forgetfulness. But deep down, it unsettled me. Max and Ali mentioned similar things in passing. Ali told me her keys kept going missing, only to turn up exactly where she'd already looked. Max joked about hearing strange knocks at his front door late at night, but when he went to check, no one was there. We laughed it off at the time, pretending it was nothing, just our nerves playing tricks on us. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had followed us home from that church. The real turning point came late one night when I was in bed, drifting in and out of sleep. That's when I heard its soft footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if someone was carefully walking through my hallway. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still. Then, the door handle rattled softly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room filled with dim yellow light, and everything went quiet. I stared at the door, expecting it to swing open, but nothing happened. The handle sat perfectly still, untouched. I told myself it was a dream, just a lingering fear from that night at the church. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps, the movement, the sense that something was standing right outside that door, it was all too real. And for the first time since that night, I realized that whatever we had encountered in that church wasn't finished with us. It had only just begun.